Often described as a Boeing 707 copycat, the Shanghai Y-10 was an attempt by the aircraft industry of the People's Republic of China to construct an airliner comparable to Western rivals, though contrary to popular belief, its intentions were not to be marketed as a mass-production machine, but instead would form the first part of a wider product range of mainstream airliners that never happened, and today stands as a relic of a long-forgotten era in China's technological past. The Shanghai Y-10 story begins with Wang Hongwen, a senior figure within the Chinese Communist Party, who had a dual interest in both expanding China's civil aviation industry and traditional Maoist isolationist economics, and through his support, the National Planning Commission and the Military Commission of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, or MCCP, would approve, in principle, a report on the transport trial production on August 21, 1970, under what was dubbed Project 708. While the next 2 years were spent largely in stasis, while decisions were made about what shape the aircraft would take, on June 27, 1973, the State Council and the MCCP approved a proposition to develop a large four-engined airliner, and work in Shanghai started in earnest. The airliner would be a cooperative effort between the Civil Aviation Administration of China, or CAAC, the Shanghai Municipal Government, and the National Planning Commission, or NPC, with the proposed flight deck of the upcoming model hosting 5 positions for pilot, co-pilot, navigator, flight engineer and radio operator, while the specification demanded a range of 4,350 miles, enough to fly non-stop from Beijing to Tirana in Albania, spurred on in part by the warm relations with Enver Hoxha's Balkan dictatorship. During this early period, what was designated the Y-10, the Y standing for Yunshuji, or transport, was being designed by an exceptionally small team, with the CAAC only having 300 people working on Project 708, though this would swell to 800 by 1973, when the program and its staff were assigned to the newly established Aircraft Design Institute under Director Ma Fengshan, renamed the Shanghai Aircraft Design and Research Institute during 1978. The blueprints and technical drawings were completed in June 1975, and upon the MPC's approval, production of the first prototype began immediately at the Shanghai Aircraft Manufacturing Factory, with static testing of a skeletonized and stripped airframe commencing in September 1976, followed by a destructive test on an 80% complete airframe on November 23, 1978, while a wing stress test was also performed, in which the wings met 100.02% of the then U.S. Federal Aviation Administration standard before their failure. There were constant problems over the choice of power plants, though, as at the outset, the Chinese designers attempted to copy the Rolls-Royce Spey power plant that was fitted to CAAC's clutch of Hawker-Siddeley Trident airliners, but in the end could not produce a sufficiently powerful or reliable engine due to the lack of suitably proficient engineers. Their efforts would ultimately shift to the Pratt & Whitney JT3D, at first using engines recovered from Pakistan International Airlines Boeing 707-340 Alpha Papa Alpha Victor Zulu that had been irreparably damaged while landing at Urumqi on December 19, 1971, this accident being caused by heavy snowfall, reducing visibility to the point that the pilots landed too far down the runway, resulting in an overshoot that severely damaged the airliner, with the crew being slightly injured. At this point, the engineers were significantly more optimistic about their prospects, as the Y-10 had grown to become a Herculean national project with more than 5 million yuan's worth of labor, facilities and capital invested into it, though once again, Chinese inexperience in this period proved fatal, with the repurposed JT3Ds, dubbed WS-8s in China, developed serious oil leaks that could not be fixed, thus leading to their abandonment. After a visit in 1972 from American President Richard Nixon, and the advent of a cooling-off period in Sino-American relations, China was allowed to purchase 10 Boeing 707-300s that were delivered during 1973, with their JT3D power units being reverse-engineered to help develop a homegrown engine for the Y-10. But again, China still had no luck in producing a functional indigenous power plant, and thus the new JT3Ds were simply imported from America as a last resort. A similar story afflicted the wings, with engineers initially attempting to copy the design from the Boeing 707 from photographs, followed later by the reverse engineering of wing fragments recovered from the crashed Alpha Papa Alpha Victor Zulu during 1971, before finally moving on to copy them outright from the 707s purchased in 1972. The result was a significant deviation from the 707 playbook from which the Y-10 was designed, and reverse-engineered wings from a Hawker Siddeley Trident bought in 1975 were incorporated instead, though the rationale behind this choice remains unclear, as it is not explained in any surviving testimony, though it does act as a rebuttal to the notion that the Y-10 was just a reverse-engineered 707. The poor quality of engineers previously noted was caused primarily by Mao's dogmatic Marxist ideology, as in 1957, Mao launched the 100 Schools of Thought campaign, intended to create a greater understanding of China's economic problems by allowing limited critique of the Chinese Communist Party or CCP economic policy, and rallying the intellectual class behind Chairman Mao as the leader to fix them. This, however, did not occur, and instead Mao, the Chinese Communist Party and Marxism itself were highlighted as the factors perceived to be holding back the growth and development of an advanced China, the result being a purge that saw just under 1 million intellectuals arrested and relocated to rural penal camps as forced labourers, causing a brain drain in both the short and long term. Furthermore, in addition to the immediate loss of intellectuals, Chinese students were discouraged from entering the fields Mao clamped down on, all of which was compounded by the destruction unleashed on China's intellectuals by the Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 1966 to 1976 and sought to preserve Chinese communism by purging all the remnants of capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society, all of which had a big impact on the development of the Y-10. In addition, the emphasis on domestic indigenous production led to development problems for the Y-10, and Chinese engineers sought to replicate Western manufacturing techniques from the resources available to them, though these efforts were simply not successful, with one example being that the desired standard requirement for the Y-10 was to use 7'2" sheets of an advanced aluminium alloy, but Chinese industry could only then produce 2.6-foot sheets. The Chinese alloy was also much thicker than its Western equivalents, causing the Y-10 to weigh 128,133 pounds empty when compared to the 122,533 pound weight of an empty Boeing 707-120, thus meaning the airliner was extremely fuel inefficient. Nevertheless, the first Y-10 airframe never flew, this being used in further static trials, which included 1,400 hours of wind tunnel tests, while the second Y-10, registered Bravo 0002, was finished and submitted for flight testing in 1980, its maiden flight taking place on September 26th of that year in the hands of Captain Wang Jinda, this aircraft going on to perform a tour of China, with a cohort of officials on board to assess its flying characteristics, handling and passenger comfort. During its journey, the Y-10 is recorded to have visited Beijing, Chengdu, Guangzhou, Harbin, Hefei, Kunming, Lhasa, and Urumqi, with notable sorties including an endurance flight lasting 4 hours and 49 minutes, a distance test of 2,236 miles, and a flight over the peak of Mount Everest, with Bravo 0002 undertaking 130 flights before it was retired in 1983, while the third and final example of the Y-10 was destined not to take to the air, being reserved solely for fatigue tests. The Y-10 project would eventually be cancelled in 1985, with the underlying factors being multifaceted, official documents from the period placing blame on the CAAC for its delays and cost overruns, while during the 1980s, under the new leadership of Deng Xiaoping, this body had the power to procure and distribute aircraft to China's various state airlines, and in 1981 made a statement proclaiming that it had absolutely no intention to buy the Y-10. This in itself marked the death of the Y-10, with the CAAC claiming it already had a sufficient inventory, and did not need to procure new aeroplanes for the foreseeable future, though this was more a case of bureaucratic politeness, as from 1981 to 1985, it purchased many new models from Boeing, including 10 737s in December 1982, while efforts to promote to the Chinese military a rotodome-equipped airborne early warning Y-10 variant, which was portrayed in model form, also came to nothing. In later interviews with historians, Senior figures from CAAC were to admit they believed the Y-10 to be unsafe and refused to order it for this reason, feeling that this was primarily due to the insufficient testing undertaken and the general perception that all aircraft to emerge from China in this period were dangerously unsafe. Politics also helped to kill the Y-10, with Deng Xiaoping, the new premier of China after Mao's death in 1976, being a victim of the Cultural Revolution purges, and behind closed doors within his cabinet, the Cultural Revolution and projects tied to it were regarded with disdain, if not outright hatred. The Y-10 was still the pet project of Wang Hongwen, who even after Mao's death remained a true believer and an advocate of the Cultural Revolution, though in a bureaucracy scrambling to distance itself from the period, Wang, and by extension the Y-10, were considered political poison, with no government officials attending the launch ceremony of the Y-10 in 1980, nor other formal occasions related to it. The Y-10 ultimately had far greater influence as a political icon than it ever had as a practical, useful airliner, and in recent years the aircraft's legacy has been recrafted from a shameful, embarrassing metaphor for the pitfalls of planned economics into a symbol of nationalistic pride for a China that was casting off the shackles of colonial humiliation and finding its place as a great power, as exemplified through a memorial plaque erected to honor the Y-10 at the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, or COMAC's Shanghai factory. In the end, only one Y-10 has been preserved, and now resides at the Shanghai Dachang Air Base, the former home of the Shanghai Aircraft Factory, which hosts a small aviation museum, while in subsequent decades, China's commercial aviation industry would focus more on collaboration with the United States, as per the trunkliner project of the 1980s and 90s, which would see license-built versions of the McDonnell Douglas MD-82, MD-83 and MD-90 constructed in China for that market. As for the manufacture of homegrown commercial airliners in China, this wouldn't return to the forefront of aviation news until the launch of the COMAC ARJ-21, which first flew in 2008, and, through its external styling, appears to owe much of its design to the trunkliner project due to its resemblance to the MD-80 series. With regard to the Y-10, even setting aside the political factors of the post-Mao leadership that sought to distance itself from the era of the Cultural Revolution, there was very little chance that the Y-10 could have successfully formed the basis of a mass production model, the airliner being very much a relic of the 1950s due to its reliance on 707 mechanics and underpinnings, and would have been starkly out of place in amongst comparatively advanced Western designs such as the Boeing 757. As is, the Y-10 was a curious attempt by the communist nation to create its own airliner, but ultimately ended without success as the technology on which it was based became more and more outdated.